Hey folks, going to take a break from working on this guitar because talking with some folks recently, even folks my own age, it seems a lot of us can't tell what's different about today's economy than the way it was up until the 70s. So let's talk about it. From the 40s to the 70s, we experienced years of a growing middle class when almost everyone reaped the benefits of a growing economy. Sure, there were still plenty of problems, but that time of economic prosperity was taken for granted. We believed there was a natural occurrence. But if you look closely, it was anything but natural. It's really important to understand how we ended up with those years of an economy that shared the gains across the board, especially if you look at what was happening before that time. Let's look back. Before those 40 years of a growing middle class was a whole nother story. Huge income inequality, out of control bankers and speculators, no social safety nets, long hours, dangerous working conditions. The very wealthy were doing very well, and working people had incredible hardships. But those hardships just didn't magically go away. We really need to remember those years of labor struggles that happened before that time, when working people had to organize to win pretty much basic human rights. There were strikes, all-out wars between people and corporate bosses. And these struggles now are all but wiped clean from our collective memory. But it's important for us to understand the connection between the years we had of a growing middle class and this all but forgotten labor struggle. After years of strikes and fighting in the streets against corporate power, and then finally after the crash in 1929, our government was forced to enact policy that would benefit the majority. The president was even afraid. He knew he had to answer to the demands of us, answer to the demands of people. This led to economic improvement for most Americans. Big business didn't just decide to create a more equitable economy. We enacted regulation, changes in tax codes, and new laws. This is what shaped the market, and the market was forced to distribute wealth more equitably. This led to the growing middle class. It led to what's the so-called golden age of capitalism, or more precisely, regulated capitalism. There's no such thing as the market over here and government over there. No. The economic climate during those years was the result of laws and regulation written in our interest. More and more families could live on one income and afford homes. But many big business owners were not happy with these changes. A growing middle class did not maximize profits. And then, was it 1971? Their complaints about all this were actually put into writing by Lewis Powell in a famous document called the Powell Memo. Powell was a lawyer who worked for the tobacco industry, who later, under President Nixon, became a Supreme Court justice. He captured the sentiment of those frustrated business owners. Corporate executives were tired of not being able to keep all the wealth. They didn't like seeing this growing middle class, didn't like seeing all the money they felt that was rightly theirs, shared with the people who helped create it. Powell referred to us as special interests that were a threat to America. Yeah. Good paying jobs for the many were pretty much cast as being a communist plot. This memo helped to set in motion what has to be called all-out class war. And this memo was sent to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and it inspired the creation of think tanks like the Heritage Foundation. These groups knew it would be necessary to use carefully crafted rhetoric to hide their plans for class war. It was clear they couldn't get politicians elected with their real agenda, an agenda that would bring back the glory days of the robber baron. They wanted to forget about well-paid workers, forget social safety nets, pensions. We'll learn how to get rid of those. Forget about the whole families living on one income. No. Their agenda was to take back the wealth. And their carefully crafted rhetoric used phrases like free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, and traditional family values. They needed to be able to mobilize votes from the very targets of this class war. And they did that by creating fear. The rhetoric about family values being under attack and government being the problem, It worked to create a smokescreen to cover the policy changes that began to happen in the 80s. The government, for a while, was working in the interests of most people. It became the boogeyman. Do you think Ronald Reagan could have been elected by being honest about the legislation he actually helped to enact? Imagine him saying, "We're going to change the tax code to distribute more wealth to people at the very top. We're going to pass laws to restrict unions. We're going to make it easy for the very rich to hide their income in offshore bank accounts. We're going to make it easy for big business to move their factories overseas to find cheap labor so they can keep most of the money they used to pay the workers here in America. We are going to convince you what is good for the corporation is good for you. We're going to wage covert war down in Central America. Got to keep the costs down for my friends' foreign investments. It might get so bad down there that their people will have to walk here for jobs and safety, but I'll convince you to blame them for your hardships." These are the things that really happened. The rhetoric of the government being too big was just one of the distractions. In fact, government grew under Ronald Reagan. But corporate power was able to shift our government from working in the interests of citizens to working for the very interests of corporations and the very wealthy. So the 1980s marked the end of regulated capitalism. You can look up actual legislation that was enacted to that time that led to these economic changes, and legislation that let bankers run amok again. For 40 years, we were protected from financial crashes. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, like the international part of the New Deal, worth looking up. But by the 80s, we were seduced by the rhetoric of the free market. We left behind regulated capitalism and were introduced to what is referred to as neoliberalism, which really never made sense to me because it wasn't new and it's definitely not liberal. But the changes in laws and tax codes starting in the 80s began a major shift in our economy. The shift that was actually documented by the Rand Corporation a few years ago caused what they say is a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the middle and lower classes to those at the very top. Not to mention a financial crash in 2008, after which we bailed out bankers and then left working people to fend for themselves. These conditions, now with most of us struggling, make it a ripe time for demagogues. Working people not only in the U.S. but around the world, they're falling under the spell of far-right rhetoric, blaming scapegoats, keeping us caught in loops of arguments that have no bearing on the truth. Even the centrists in government have allowed themselves to fall under the control of corporations and banks. They fear losing corporate support and getting attacked by the media if they step too far away from the corporate agenda. We're experiencing inequality worse than the days of the robber barons now. The far right is quick with the rhetoric to stir up hatred and scapegoating, while the laws that really affect us are written in the shadows. The few good people that have managed to get elected to Congress get vilified by the media. Anyone who doesn't uphold the corporate agenda is being portrayed as some kind of radical. Somehow all of us working people need to see through the rhetoric and learn how to work together while we still have a chance.